Welcome to day 322 of the New Way. Now let's look at John's account of Jesus' final trial with Pilate. He gives a little more detail. I'll read John 18:38 through 40. "What is truth?" retorted Pilate. With this he went out again to the Jews gathered there and said, "I find no basis for a charge against him, but it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release the King of the Jews?" They shouted back, "No, not him. Give us Barabbas." Now Barabbas had taken part in an uprising. I'll continue to read John 19:1 through 16. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they slapped him in the face. Once more Pilate came out and said to the Jews gathered there, "Look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him." When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." As soon as the chief priest and their officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify! Crucify!" But Pilate answered, "You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." The Jewish leaders insisted, "We have a law, and according to that law, he must die, because he claimed to be the Son of God." When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid, and he went back inside the palace. "Where do you come from?" he asked Jesus. But Jesus gave him no answer. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. "Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jewish leaders kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the Stone Pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about noon. "Here is your king," Pilate said to the Jews. But they shouted, "Take him away! Take him away! Crucify him!" "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priest answered. Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. So the soldiers took charge of Jesus. Pilate had Jesus flogged. Now, I don't want to go into gory details, but a Roman flogging is brutal. It is done with a whip that has pieces of bone and metal and sharp glass pieces tied into the cords. Many people died from the flogging because of the loss of blood. Now you need to know that a person who was going to be crucified wasn't usually flogged. first. Pilate had him flogged, hoping that the Jewish leaders would be satisfied. They weren't. They wanted him dead. This is just another example of Satan making Jesus' pain as bad as possible. Listen to Pilate's reaction when they said that he claimed to be the Son of God. I'll read John 19:8 again. When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid. How much power do you think Pilate had when he couldn't even make his judgment stick? Jesus said that Pilate had no power over him except what God gave him. We've talked before about Satan attacking your weakest spot to make you cave in to temptation. Listen to what the Pharisees used as their final attack on Pilate. We'll tell Caesar that you aren't his friend. Sounds almost childish, doesn't it? But that's the way Satan works. It was Friday. Passover began at 6 p.m. or sundown on Thursday night. And remember that Jesus ate the Seder meal with his apostles on that Thursday night. But in Jerusalem and the surrounding territory of Judea, all day Friday was their day of preparation for the Seder feast. What time of day was it? According to John 19:14, it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about noon. Here is your king, Pilate said to the Jews. John said that it was around noon. Actually, he says it was around the 6th hour, which someone translated as noon, when Pilate made his judgment. However, later we'll see that Mark records that it was about 9 a.m. when Jesus was nailed to the cross. Whoa, stop! Why the discrepancy? So I investigated. Mark says that Jesus was nailed to the cross at the 3rd hour, which is 9 a.m. And John says that Pilate pronounced his judgment at the 6th hour, which is noon. There's a difference there. Why? In the Jewish way of keeping time, time was divided into night and day starting at sundown. So approximately 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. was night, and 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. was day. But remember that they didn't wear watches or carry cell phones to tell time. They watched the sun's location primarily, so everything is approximate. Now here in John 19:14, John says that Pilate pronounced judgment on Jesus at the 6th hour. Using the Jewish method of keeping time, that would be noon. But what if you weren't using the Jewish method? Some scholars believe that John was using Roman time. Now, Roman time is the same as our time system. They counted a day as being from 12 midnight until 12 midnight. Using the Roman time system, the 6th hour of the day was 6 a.m. Why would John use Roman time when all the other writers are using Jewish time? It's just speculation on my part, but I believe it was because of something significant that happened between the time that Matthew, Mark, and Luke wrote their accounts in 50 to 60 A.D. and when John wrote his account in 85 to 90 A.D. You see, in 70 AD, Rome cracked down on Jewish autonomy, destroyed the Jewish temple, and most of Jerusalem. I believe that from that point on, the Jewish way of counting was considered archaic or out of date. No pun intended. So I believe that John began using the Roman time for his writings so that his readers would not be confused, which is very confusing because Matthew, Mark, and Luke wrote in Jewish time. In a later study, I'll show you another incident that shows that John is using Roman time instead of Jewish time, but we'll get to that later. Long story short, there is no discrepancy in these two scriptures. There is just an error in the NIV translation and many of the other translations. But don't be afraid to investigate God's word. It is true and reliable. Finally, Pilate turned him over to the soldiers to crucify him sometime before 9 a.m. This is so hard to even think about. It is so sad, but you need to know that the wages of sin is death. Jesus paid this price for you and for me. In his service, Dale.